The U.S. national debt, the total borrowed by the federal government to cover deficits, is a cornerstone of American fiscal policy, yet its very definitions create confusion. Debt held by the public, at $30.12 trillion as of September 2025, reflects external borrowing, while total public debt outstanding, at $37.45 trillion, includes intragovernmental holdings. The popular notion of $33 to $35 trillion stems from rounded or earlier public-held debt figures. Total federal liabilities, at $45.56 trillion per the FY, fiscal year, 2024 financial report, encompass debt, interest, and accrued obligations like veterans' benefits, highlighting the comprehensive fiscal burden. Debt accumulates from budget deficits driven by spending on defense, social programs, and economic crises, financed through Treasury securities. This report examines debt definitions, calculations, historical evolution, accumulation factors, and ties to economic metrics like the M2 money supply, at $21.94 trillion, which includes cash, checking deposits, savings deposits, money market funds, and other near-money assets, measuring liquidity available for spending and lending, and the $28.5 trillion GDP, clarifying the scope and implications of national debt. The $45.56 trillion figure includes $28.3 trillion in debt and interest, $15 trillion in employee/veteran benefits, and $2.2 trillion in other liabilities, calculated actuarially to reflect long-term commitments beyond the $37.45 trillion gross debt or $30.12 trillion public-held debt. The popular $33 to $35 trillion figure, cited in media, simplifies public-held debt for its economic relevance. Interest payments of $879.9 billion, consumer debt at $4.8 trillion, mortgage debt at $13 trillion, and corporate debt at $17 trillion illustrate debt's economic role, driven by Federal Reserve rates of 4.75 to 5%. The debt's history, from Revolutionary War loans to modern deficits, shows cycles of borrowing for wars and stimulus, with reasons tied to revenue shortfalls and policy choices. For sections explore debt definitions, history and accumulation, economic interconnections, and figure discrepancies, concluding with debt's systemic significance. Part 1. Definitions and calculations of U.S. national debt. U.S. national debt is the total amount borrowed by the federal government via Treasury securities to finance deficits. Definitions vary by scope. Debt held by the public, at $30.12 trillion as of September 12, 2025, includes marketable securities owned by external entities, individuals, corporations, state governments, the Federal Reserve, and foreign investors. Calculated daily through Treasury auctions, it drives economic impacts like interest rates and is often cited as $33 to $35 trillion in media due to 2024 data or rounding. Total public debt outstanding, or gross national debt, is $37.45 trillion, combining public-held debt with $7.39 trillion in intragovernmental holdings, such as Social Security and Medicare trust funds, non-marketable securities. Reported in the Treasury's Debt to the Penny, it's the debt ceiling benchmark, capturing all federal liabilities. The popular $33 to $35 trillion figure reflects public-held debt's economic focus, simplifying its 99:1 20% GDP ratio. Total federal liabilities, at $45.56 trillion per the FY 2024 financial report, include $28.3 trillion in debt and interest, $15 trillion in federal employee and veteran benefits payable, and $2.2 trillion in environmental and other obligations. Calculated actuarially, discounting future payouts, this figure captures long-term commitments beyond gross debt, such as $78.3 trillion in unfunded social insurance over 75 years. It emphasizes the full fiscal burden, contrasting with the $37.45 trillion standard metric. Debt calculations begin with deficits, expenditures exceeding revenues, financed by issuing securities. Public-held debt tracks market borrowing, gross debt includes internal accounting, and $45.56 trillion incorporates future obligations. These metrics tie to economic indicators. Rising debt increases the M2 money supply via Federal Reserve purchases, raising inflation risks, while $879.9 billion in interest payments strains fiscal resources. Part 2. Brief history and accumulation of U.S. national debt. The U.S. national debt began during the Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783, with $75 million borrowed from domestic and foreign sources, notably France. Alexander Hamilton's 1790 Assumption Plan consolidated state debts into a federal $75 million obligation, embedding borrowing in fiscal policy. The War of 1812 raised debt to $127 million, but Andrew Jackson's 1835 payoff, reducing it to $1.1 million in 2025 dollars via land sales and tariffs, was a rare near-zero balance. The Civil War escalated debt to $2.7 billion by 1865, funded by bonds and greenbacks. Post-war growth lowered the GDP ratio to 30% by 1900. World War I tripled debt to $25 billion, and the Great Depression added $20 billion through New Deal stimulus. World War II surged it to $260 billion, 120% GDP, via war bonds. Post-war prosperity reduced the ratio to 30% by 1980, but Reagan's tax cuts and defense spending doubled it to $2.6 trillion. Clinton's 1990 surpluses trimmed debt to 55% of GDP, but 2001 tax cuts, Iraq/Afghanistan wars, and the 2008 crisis pushed it to $13 trillion by 2011. COVID-19 stimulus added $7 trillion, reaching $23 trillion public-held debt by 2021. As of September 2025, public-held debt is $30.12 trillion, gross debt $37.45 trillion, and total liabilities $45.56 trillion, reflecting deficits averaging $1.5 trillion annually since 2009. Debt accumulates from deficits driven by mandatory spending, Social Security, Medicare, 60% of budget, discretionary outlays, defense, education, 30%, and interest payments, $879.9 billion. Revenue shortfalls from tax cuts, economic downturns, and crises like pandemics necessitate borrowing. The $45.56 trillion liability figure, including $15 trillion in benefits, underscores long-term pressures beyond the $33 to $35 trillion popular estimate. Part 3. Ties between national debt and economic metrics. National debt interlinks with economic metrics, shaping fiscal and monetary outcomes. The M2 money supply, at $21.94 trillion in September 2025, measures liquidity for spending and lending. Debt fuels M2 through Federal Reserve purchases of treasuries, injecting liquidity, as seen in post-2008 quantitative easing. Rising debt, $30.12 trillion public held, $37.45 trillion gross, $45.56 trillion liabilities, increases money creation, risking inflation. GDP, at $28.5 trillion, Q2 2025 annualized, measures economic output. Public-held debt at 106% of GDP signals fiscal strain, gross debt at 131%, and liabilities at 160% highlight broader risks. High debt raises interest rates, crowding out private investment and slowing GDP growth. Interest payments, $879.9 billion in 2025, consume 15% of revenues, limiting infrastructure spending and worsening deficits. Consumer debt, $4.8 trillion, including credit cards, auto loans, and mortgage debt, $13 trillion, reflect household borrowing, spurred by treasury yields but rising with debt pressures, 6 to 7% mortgage rates. Corporate debt, $17 trillion, funds expansion but risks defaults if yields spike. The Federal Reserve's 4.75 to 5% rate influences these, as higher rates on $37.45 trillion gross debt elevate borrowing costs. The $45.56 trillion liability figure, emphasizing unfunded obligations, contrasts with $33 to $35 trillion public estimates, affecting perceptions of debt's impact on M2, GDP, and $879.9 billion interest costs. Foreign holdings, $9 trillion, 25% of public debt, tie debt to dollar stability, reinforcing economic interconnections. Part 4. Discrepancies in national debt figures and their implications. Discrepancies in U.S. national debt figures arise from definitional scope. Debt held by the public, $30.12 trillion as of September 2025, includes marketable securities owned by external entities, calculated via treasury auctions. It drives interest rates and is cited as $33 to $35 trillion in media due to earlier 2024 to 2025 data or rounding. Total public debt outstanding, $37.45 trillion, adds $7.39 trillion in intragovernmental holdings, Social Security, Medicare trust funds, non-marketable securities. Tracked by debt to the penny, it's the debt ceiling benchmark. The popular $33 to $35 trillion figure simplifies public-held debt's economic focus. Total federal liabilities, $45.56 trillion per the FY 2024 financial report, include $28.3 trillion in debt and interest, $15 trillion in employee/veteran benefits, and $2.2 trillion in other obligations. Calculated actuarially, discounting future payouts, it captures future commitments, like $78.3 trillion in unfunded social insurance, beyond $37.45 trillion gross debt. This figure emphasizes long-term fiscal risks. Additional metrics include $24.4 trillion held by private investors and $9 trillion by foreigners. Discrepancies: $30.12 trillion public, $37.45 trillion gross, $45.56 trillion liabilities, reflect inclusion, market-driven, total liabilities, or comprehensive obligations. These shape perceptions, with public-held debt driving policy, gross debt setting legal limits, and $45.56 trillion warning of future strains on $21.94 trillion M2, $28.5 trillion GDP, and $879.9 billion interest costs. Conclusion: calculations, history, and fiscal discrepancies. The U.S. national debt, amassed since 1775, is defined by multiple metrics: $30.12 trillion debt held by the public, $37.45 trillion total public debt outstanding, and $45.56 trillion total federal liabilities as of September 2025. The popular $33 to $35 trillion figure reflects earlier public-held debt, while $45.56 trillion captures debt, interest, and accrued benefits, underscoring long-term obligations. Debt accumulates from deficits driven by mandatory spending, discretionary outlays, and crises, financed by Treasury securities. Tied to a $21.94 trillion M2 money supply, cash, checking deposits, savings deposits, money market funds, near money assets, $28.5 trillion GDP, $879.9 billion interest payments, $4.8 trillion consumer debt, $13 trillion mortgage debt, and $17 trillion corporate debt. The debt fuels economic activity but risks inflation and crowding out. Discrepancies: $30.12 trillion public, $37.45 trillion gross, $45.56 trillion liabilities, reflect varying scopes, with public-held debt shaping markets, gross debt setting legal limits, and $45.56 trillion signaling future pressures. These metrics, rooted in a history of borrowing from wars to pandemics, affirm debt's systemic role, with ongoing deficits ensuring its growth.